Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Tina Montreuil, a clinical cognitive behavioral psychologist who works largely in the area of the intergenerational transmission of mental health and illness. Tina Montreuil is an associate professor in the Department of Educational and Counselling Psychology at McGill University, an associate member of the Pediatrics and Psychiatry departments at McGill University, holds a scientist appointment at the Research Institute of the McGill University Healthcare Center, is a research scientist at the Research Center of the St. Justine Hospital, Montreal's Hospital for Children, and is also the director of the Childhood Anxiety and Regulations of Emotions Laboratory Research Group. Tina, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I usually like to start off by asking my guests a little bit about their own work, their own research.
Yeah, so my research mainly focuses on really promoting, or I should say identifying, factors that are involved, or mechanisms and factors involved in the promotion of child development, but mainly child well-being. And so therefore, that brings me to really focus on systemic aspects of surrounding the child, right? From the quality of the education they receive, to the type of parenting and the parenting care that they receive. And so largely a lot of the research that I do has a clinical component, as you can see. So there's like sort of therapy or at least therapeutic frameworks embedded in the research that I conduct. And in the more recent years, because the focus is so much to promote family health and really in an angle to optimize child outcomes, a lot of my work now is focused more on the promotion of parental health during pregnancy. From a perspective of prevention, I think many in my circle would agree that, including people with lived experience, parents that I've actually worked with, would have wished or hoped that they could receive some parenting coaching and tools and strategies and be more aware of the importance of taking care of oneself in transitioning into parenthood while you're still waiting for the child to arrive, so that when the child does arrive and is born, you could say you've tried to put everything under a scope of well-being, or at least as best as possible, try to promote the family health, right? So for those who've been parents, when we're planning for baby's arrival, there's a great motivation to get the little closet ready with their clothes, even though they're not yet there, get their room ready. But I think a lot of us do not realize that parental emotional health and psychological health is also part of that, of baby's arrival. We need as parents to be ready for that. And so what better time to work on those aspects of our own well-being than when the baby's not yet there, right? So that's sometimes people don't see the connection between child development and optimizing child health and that piece of pregnancy. But when you look at it from a perspective of prevention and you explain it in that way, I think it becomes clear for people how there is a direct link between working in pregnancy and prevention and optimizing child outcome.
That's so interesting because what you just said makes a lot of sense. But then I would have thought that people would have already known that or would have already, like our culture doesn't seem to have clued in.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the times when I would say maybe even when we're talking to parents themselves, like I think the minute that you talk to them about the need to take care of oneself, there's almost this thing that happens where, and we're going to talk about history today, but it's almost as if parents forget themselves. There's a piece of themselves when they're transitioning into parenthood. And I think there's parents that don't, and it's probably protective. They do understand that their own self, their history, who they are, is still important, and they'll have to carve out time for that to remain intact. And I think that probably serves a very protective role for the parents, but also the children. But then there are some people who, for some reason, maybe it's the way they was taught to them, maybe probably, with what I do, it's socialized that way. You had a mother, you had a father, or both, that their whole life when children arrive was now their children's life. It's as if their own history was no longer necessarily being factored in. And so we have an element of re-education to let parents know, you know what, you cannot offer your children what you don't have. And part of your history, who you are, and nurturing that sense of self is critical in ensuring that you can transfer that element of well-being. If you're a happy parent, if you're happy with who you are, then you'll be able to also be happy in that role of parenthood, which is very challenging. Like I always tell parents, it's probably the most difficult job for which you have the least amount of training.
That is so interesting. I have so many questions, but the first one that comes to mind is usually when you think of intergenerational trauma, it seems to be the opposite, where the parent doesn't want to let go of the child, and it's done in an unconscious way where there's this aura, this field of energy, or some people call it a generational atmosphere that somehow instills itself into the mental topography, let's say, of the child, where the child and the parent become one, and there's and there's no demarcation, and the child doesn't necessarily live their own life.
Exactly. And so I think we refer to that as almost dissociation or repression, right? It's a way of repressing our own history, right? But I've worked with people who have presented with very, very difficult and harsh history, especially in their past as children. And in fact, despite all odds, because they chose to recall the painful parts of their history, their personal history, it served as an anchor to basically I remember what I've experienced, and now I'm getting into a position where I want to ensure that this child that's coming never experiences what I've experienced. And I think the only way that a parent that has a history of trauma, since we're talking to that, can actually move forward and create a better generational transmission or factors of general transmission is by knowing, like remembering, what were the situations that I was involved in where a parent wasn't there to protect me, that I can then maybe as a parent become more aware that I need to exercise. So I think we know in psychotherapy that repression of one's history, I'm using that word here because of the context of this discussion, but repression of our story.
Is that what it is? Story?
It's our story. It's our past. It's our personal experience, right? The fact that I'm repressing that, the fact that I'm even sometimes dissociating with that, which are, as you said, they're unconscious, I think to a certain extent could explain why I don't have these sort of posts to, in the future, protect myself. And I guess as a parent, as our responsibility is also ensuring the protection of our offspring, our child, right? Yeah. So it's in thinking about this discussion, it's clear that recalling the difficult pieces of our past, of our history, serves a positive purpose of rebirth, of renewing something, starting over. And this intergenerational piece gives us an opportunity, if we work on oneself, by sort of creating a new story for ourselves or changing the parts of the story for ourselves as future parents, or just individuals. I just talked about it in the context of my research, right? But I think offers the possibility to then offer the creation of a better story for the offspring, the child.
Very interesting. We're going to get into that in more detail in a moment, but I'd like to first better understand why, like what drives you to do your work, and what led you to getting a PhD in clinical psychology, and what led you to do the research that you're doing today.
Yeah. So as far as I can remember, and I do that, I know that because part of my role as teaching future clinicians and school psychologists or just psychologists more generally involves them becoming aware. If they've never been aware, like part of my role is to make them aware of their history and their past. Because it's critical to know oneself in order to be able to just plan out certain things, expect, for example, maybe the way you'll react in a certain context. To know oneself is knowing where I might be more vulnerable. And when we're becoming psychologists, it's not that we're no longer vulnerable, but it's really a new role that's being created, right? We're creating an identity where we have to support others with the right craft and skills and strategies to go through themselves a tough time. But you can't be a psychologist helping out others if you're not well yourself. So we're taught that, and I wish other professions would extend that, but we're taught that really early to really look after our well-being in order to be able to help others. You can't, it's almost the analogy of the oxygen mask, right? When we board planes, like we're reminded that, in case of emergency, we need to put on our oxygen mask first in order to be able to attend to others, or before we attend to others. And the premise is that if I'm running out of oxygen as I'm trying to help someone else, because I really care more for them, like really sometimes, is that if I run out of oxygen, if I don't take care of my own well-being, then I might actually be incapacitated and not be able to care for the person I want to care for. So essentially, we know that analogy as psychotherapists going into the craft. And the same should be taught to a lot of professions, to teachers, definitely to parents, right? You can't care for kids if you yourself are in a place of precarity. But going back to your question, in telling and coaching the future psychologists on that, it brings me to even myself think about my own history. And the earliest I can remember is being in elementary school and just really having that humanitarian side of me where I've always been, I don't know why, but I've always been inclined. For sure, I'm highly empathetic. I'm highly observant. And so even before being trained as a behavioral analyst, so by looking and observing and putting pieces together, the nonverbal with the verbal, with the surroundings, the reactions to the surrounding, and depicting a picture, I was already doing that in some way, like intuitively. So I really feel like definitely the profession of caring for others, like the sort of like, when you do the inventory of interests, which is like the counseling component, I've had as long as I can remember. So I have memories of being in the schoolyard and helping out a girl that's getting, like bullied by someone. And then I getting in the crossfire and getting my hair pulled because I'm trying to help someone else. But I recall, I have very vivid memories of that, like really early. And so I think I've just grown, like getting into my teenage years, like once I graduated high school, I didn't backpack to Europe. I did a lot of humanitarian trips into Haiti and these types of places. So I've always had that edge. And I think that brings me back to also like my family heritage. We were a family where we discussed a lot, a family where the care of others was highly valued. And so I think it's through these conversations of family history and passing on, not just the good things, but the ugly things too. And reminding us, I had parents who reminded me of how much they invested in their story so that ours could be better. So I was privileged that way to have that. And so it's not that I was aware of that young, but as I'm becoming more mature and aging, that's becoming evident to me that a lot of who I am today was passed on through stories, through the history that I wasn't privy to, but became a witness to through these exchanges and these communications with not just my parents, but also like extended family members. So I was very much surrounded by family growing up. Like I have a lot of memories of being, like my mom's brothers and sisters, they were a large family. And just growing up with my cousins, and I have vivid memories of that. And I think that was very formative to who I am today.
A lot of love.
A lot of love.
That's amazing.
Some dysfunction too. Like, there's no perfect family, right? I want to make sure I put that out there. But more good than bad. And I always tell people, it's transactional. Think about it like almost like from your bank activity. As long as there's more deposits, than there are debits. You know, when storm comes and your roof needs to be changed and a huge chunk of change is going to be taken out of your account, as long as there were anticipation, you were preparing, you were putting in a lot of love and a lot of, you know, even in spite of the negative thing, I think that's very protective. So definitely there was elements of that. But was it all perfect? Absolutely not. But more love than not, definitely.
Really interesting. Thank you for that. So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history, and why?
I guess, and I know when I think about that, I guess the earliest part might be difficult. I guess the earliest might be like what I just talked about, like, you know, just kind of like being made aware of what was invested in the generations past to end up where I was at. So even though sometimes I didn't have much memories of certain, like for example, maybe grandparents or other family members, I think, or even of my parents, you know, younger, I think it was clear that there was a lot of investment put in. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question well, but the earliest, you know, sort of memory that I have of being, I guess, introduced to the notion of history would be through family history.
So the earliest connection or earliest memories through family?
Absolutely.
And the image that comes to mind?
The image that comes to mind is, you know, I think a lot of the times when I think back history, there's probably a lot of open space, a lot of, it's definitely not the urban scenery. And I think that reflects where my upbringing was, like where I grew up. I grew up in a very, very rural area where our town was about 2,000 people, so very small. So I think when I think history pertaining to my personal history, when I think history, not general, like not obviously like history of the United States or of Canada, when I think about my history, it's like it's very open. It's very, and I think that reflects like the environment in which I grew up, and which was a lot of play and a lot of community and just space, you know, like just having space, not feeling tight. Does that make sense?
It does. And how about culture and tradition?
Yeah.
Or is that adding too much?
Well, the reality is that in the present time, I am very interested in growing that sort of cultural sensitivity and humility. And I think it's because I come from, and I'm not that old, but I come from a time and a place, more importantly, where that element of diversity and cultural, like, you know, like, I mean, we were very
insular.
Very much so. Very homogeneous, I was going to say.
Homogeneous,
like, very, like, we looked alike. Like, it wasn't very diverse, you know? But it felt secure at the time, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's when I look back, like, why am I so interested now? Or why does that speak so much to me of, you know, whether it's a workshop or whether it's wanting to, you know, add to my courses and what I want to do in terms of professional development. I have to do that on a yearly basis with my professional accreditation. And I think it probably comes from a bit of that, like wanting to compensate for maybe that lack. That would be a lack, I would say, like, you know, not being exposed to as much diversity. But definitely when I came to McGill, because I'm a graduate of McGill, Montreal offered me that new history, that new exposure. So came full circle.
Good. And I thought you were from Outremont and went to Brébeuf for some reason.
No.
Okay.
False. No.
So that's interesting. I see that the first thing that came to mind was this experiential understanding of history as opposed to a more political or external understanding of history external to yourself.
Yeah. But I do remember, like, I was good in school and I loved school. Like, I remember, like, even history of, like, playing amongst the family, like being the teacher and my chalkboard and like having old books. As I've been, so even that, I'm like, who knew that I would become a professor? Because I didn't set out to become a professor. Like my first really desire was to be more like either a doctor, which then I discovered I have a certain intolerance to to blood. So that didn't work out that well for me. And then having like most people done like psychology 101, I'm like, hey, how about psychology, you know? But, you know, I remember like history. We learned like history of the Nouvelle-France because, you know, I was in Acadie. We learned a lot about being colonized by the French. And so I've always been very intrigued. And actually, even to this day, like I'm part of a book club. And whenever we fall on the fictional books, I'm like, oh, no, they've lost me. Because I like nonfiction. I like biography. I like history. I like things that I can sort of anchor myself in. Like I like to have that point of reference. I'm someone very concrete, tangential. When you invited me to this show, to this opportunity, to this podcast, that I started thinking more about it. And I was like, wow, there's more connections with history than I thought. So I would have to thank you for this invitation because it's made me really reflect a lot.
Interesting.
And it did exactly what you told me it would do when you were talking to me about this project. So,
which was
that, you know, like history can apply to so many things.
Yes.
But I mean, so this is why it's like the purpose of this podcast. It's amazing. I'm a big fan already because I think it's true. It's so embedded, and even in like, you know, for example, I told you about, you know, in what I do, like history is, you know, a lot of my role is digging into people's history to better understand their now. Mm-hmm. And, you know, how I conceptualize helping them is by basing myself or anchoring myself into history of psychological theory and framework, right? Mm-hmm. And how I know it works is because history has shown us that by implementing these theories, or what these, we could just say at some point, these concepts into designs and research protocols and test them over time, by them being test-worthy and being stable, they become theory. So I never realized that a lot of the work that I do as a psychologist is so embedded in history. Of course, a different type of history, but nonetheless, if you look at the definition, one of the definitions of history, my job would not be possible without relying on history as a leverage by which to induce change, right? And create a new history. So there's also that piece as well. You're creating a new now, which eventually will become a new part of your history.
Yeah, which you co-construct with your clients or patients, rather.
Yes.
Yes, you're a historian and he didn't even know. I love that. So, could you describe a moment in time where you had to justify the importance of using history or a story, history for our purposes, for attaining a goal or for making positive social change through your work? And could you justify why you did that?
Yeah. So I think I just addressed that now, right? I think, like we talk about in French, the term is anamnèse. And anamnèse, in a sense, is recounting, creating a history of the individual's life. Like you're really drawing a timeline. Mm-hmm. Literally, when I teach, there's a course here at McGill, like EDSP 682, and it's the first practicum with real life individuals that we get assigned to from our clinic here. And one of the first things that I do is I have to have students, interns, trainees, draw a timeline, and we start from birth. What happened at birth? Like, were there any complications? How was pregnancy? Like, you really go into all the details, all the way till, let's say, if you're dealing with a 13-year-old, 17-year-old, 7-year-old, you draw the story of their life. And in the absence of understanding that history well, it's nearly impossible to come up with a very sound intervention plan. We know that a sound evaluation starts with understanding your client's history well on many aspects or domain, like from educational to psychological or psychiatric, health, financial, relocations. All these elements of the person's history is building an understanding, because all you have is a snapshot of that client in the moment. But having a good understanding of where you're going to go with this patient client requires a very thorough understanding of their history, and that probably of their family as well, right? Because of that intergenerational piece, the children are the byproduct of their family. So this is in my everyday functioning. This is how, for example, history serves me best. It's part of my daily interactions with individuals. It starts with their history.
So in a way, you've defined history as a life experience, a life story. It provides context and it helps you do the work that you do and to help the client patients you work with.
It's what's most salient, right? There's other things like as part of like my role as everyday thing, like I was telling you about like the readings or the interest the literary interest that I have, right? So that's definitely part of that. I'm also aware of, like everyday, events that occur, right? So I'm aware of that as well. And I would even say like, depending, usually we refer it to more of a generational thing or an age thing, but within that age thing, there's also the context, the social context, which in and of itself is embedded in a history component, right? Will also affect, like we know from different models, like for example, the Bronfenbrenner model, there's like what I just described, like at the micro level, there's the person's story, there's at the more external level, there's their education and who they were with, and did they grow up in the same family, with their parents split, like all these things affect. But then there's also the exosystem, which is the society, the cultural context, the time, the history in which they were growing. And that supersedes how the individual evolves. So to a certain extent, it's not just the immediate factors that will impact that individual, but history itself, like how history is unraveling within a geopolitical context, is also going to play an effect on the society in which that individual grows, evolves, and then as well, like how they will be defined, right? So that's why talking about the rural piece before, but I think that has an impact. Like probably when you're, I don't know, maybe when you are living in a smaller town where things are slower and you're more aware, more attuned to what's going on around you, maybe that has an element of like building greater empathy or just kind of being more aware of what others are experiencing as opposed to being maybe in a big city where it's very diverse and people are busy, faster pace. So certainly that bared an influence on my own history.
So if we were to bring all that you said together, would you be able to attempt to provide a working definition of what history is?
I would say that history is a combination of events, combination of experiences that over time evolve. History is something that we can actually change. And maybe that's the most unconventional part of the definition, where sometimes when we're part of something, you just feel like it's evolving and it's the way it is. I guess in my conception and with the work that I do, and when I prioritize the environment so much, I really do think that the individual has the opportunity or the possibility to induce change on that history. And so it's not this like predetermined thing. It's not fixed, it's not rigid, but it's something that once defined you, it's part of who you are, but it's not absolute. And I think that's what's so refreshing, is that it's good for people like me that have this kind of like nice history, right? But I think it's also great for people who are like, well, that was not my upbringing. And then you can say, okay, I get that. But you have now, as an adult anyways, you have the opportunity to be able to construct a different history, a new part of that history. Infused by the work that I do, that's how I would define like history.
No, it's good. It's very interesting. And I like how you brought in the reflexivity angle in a way. How my understanding of history for now is I view it more as the interpretation of the movement of time.
Oh, that is so interesting.
And we actually engage in those interpretations to be able to orient ourselves in our daily encounters in our world. So reflexivity is really important because it helps in a way, not fine-tune, but yeah, fine-tune or refine.
And I love what you said, and it just clicked with what I was thinking, because this is why it's our who we are is not just defined by our true history, but also our perception of the history.
That's right.
So that means that I think that you're talking about trauma earlier. It's not just a lot of like pathological disorders, because we've come up with these terms, right? But these conventions, but a lot of these complications of the human psyche arise not just because we were actually subjected to these experiences as part of our history, but also the interpretation of these experiences. And I think that's the essence in and of itself of resilience, is that some people don't hold the same interpretation of the experiential component of their history. And so for me, if I choose to view, maybe I chose to view that as, we're talking about repression or suppression before. Maybe if I change the way I view that experience, you were talking about
reflexivity. Yeah,
there you go. It will have on a maybe you didn't know this, but on a clinical or psychological or psychiatric approach, it can play in two ways. If I may have had like the upbringing that I told you, my history is focused more, it doesn't delineate or take away from the negative thing. I actually brought it up. But my focus is really much more on the positive things of my upbringing, right? And so it has a protective role. But perhaps maybe if my inclination was to actually focus more on the negative things, or even have had a negative interpretation of certain things, the me who I am now would be very different, right? And part of psychotherapy is that. It's in some way, it's changing the perception of that history. And that's how we can actually create a change in that history, right? But it's, when you said, I think it was just more about the perception. It's not just what actually happened to you that negatively impacts you or positively impacts you. It's also how you perceive it. So a lot of what we have to do is just kind of question ourselves, like, how am I perceiving the situation? It's the basis of actually stress reactivity. I do that in my workshop. I teach people, like, Lazarus had that principle. It's not the situation. Like, it's not, for example, the soon to be coming snow that's causing me to be stressed. It's the interpretation that I'm making of that event, that life event. So for some people, the minute I say snowstorm, they think, oh, wow, I'll be able to ski. I'll be able to snowshoe. I'll be able to go to the cottage and play in the snow, right? So the reading, the interpretation that I'm making of that event is affecting how I'm reacting to it. On the same token, if my thought of snowstorm is snowbanks, extra traffic, potential accidents.
The glass is half empty.
Then my reaction is a much more negative one, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, it took us on a little bit of a tangent, but I just thought it was your definition spoke to me, because it would fit. It would fit in a clinical context, maybe without you even being aware.
Well, I am inspired a lot by I don't know what to say, how to call it, but you'll read my book.
I can't wait.
Oh, thank you. So based on what you've said then, is history a good thing or a bad thing?
History is what it is, right? I think on the premise of resilience, your history is a good thing, because you can always, I'm not going to use the word profit, but you can always grow. There's always something that can come out of your history. I really firmly believe that. I think I'd be a bad therapist if I didn't. But I think the moment you start accepting history for what it is, I think it opens a door to a lot of potential for good things to come in terms of personal growth. So I think just kind of fighting or questioning why is that part of my history? Like, again, I'm talking from a more psyche or more psychiatric or psychological like history, right? Or identity, right? But I think even that could apply to like a geopolitical, like, maybe you're from a country where certain things have, there's a heavy history to some part of your social constructs or social identity. I think the only way that you can change or make history better is by sitting with what history is at the time, and then either brainstorming, troubleshoot, problem solve, and come up with, where do I want to be? Do I want to stay in this history? Is this my history? Is this how I'm defined?
So it's future oriented in many ways.
It is. And I think, it's probably is my definition of what I'm giving you now is probably very much inspired by, for example, I'm not a psychoanalyst really, right? Because like psychoanalytical theory or psychodynamic principles are very focused on the past, right? It doesn't necessarily say you'll stay like that, but the focus is really much more in the past. Whereas like some more cognitivist or systemic approaches are much more focused on, the future. Like, what is it that I want to, more of a growth mindset, right? Much more anchored in the resilience. So the salutogenesis instead of like the pathological or the pathogenesis. So where you're focusing on what is the past, but more so moving forward of what I want it to become.
That's so interesting.
So I think you cannot reject or rebuke like your history or history. Mm-hmm. I think you just have to sit with what it is, see the good things and the bad things of that history, and then kind of determine like where you want to take it from there.
So there's a lot of agency in it. I have a quick question. You mentioned the term resiliency a few times. Is there a working definition of being resilient, and how does it connect to history?
Well, it very much connects to history, because resiliency it's basically breaking the odds in the face of adverse historical events, if I had to just add in the history piece there. But it's like you cannot talk of resiliency or resilience in the absence of adversity, which speaks to a past, which speaks to something that is retrograde behind us, right? So essentially, resilience exists on the basis of the odds were that with a history like that, I would end up here. Somehow, here's where I am.
So you're able to reinvent yourself.
Yeah, you were able to sort of
take charge,
whether it was conscious or not, whether it was induced by other people that were significant around you. Could have been like at that time, maybe you were in a more, I should say, a family dynamic that was not optimal, but maybe you had a great and supportive coach. Maybe you had a teacher that praised you and highlighted your strength every single time that you put yourself down. Like, it could be that it was very much self-driven, but it's usually a combination of both. Like, there's something about the child in this evolution that just kind of wanted to beat odds. Like, we could talk about it, social Darwinism. We could talk about it in different perspective, but certainly there's key actors when you start like looking at the history of that individual. There's usually key players that have also been like catalysts to induce or initiate or sustain that sort of beating the odds and resilience.
So it's like this mindset that we've gained through therapy, or have gained over our lives and our different life experiences, where we want to overcome challenges and succeed or excel at what we do.
Yeah, for some people it was as a result of therapy, and for other people it just happened. It just really happened, right?
Interesting.
And so I would say that, whenever you're talking about resilience, it's difficult to tease that apart from an historical perspective, right? Because there's like that sort of dynamic process between a point in time and where you're at now. And typically with those conditions at one point in the past, this is what it should have been, but it's not. So there's a temporal dimension to resilience, right?
Yeah, which is interesting, and it really reflects the way you end up deciding on how to use your history at the end of the day.
Exactly. It brings back to the perspective afterwards, right? Any resilient person will I will tell on average, most resilient people will not deny their past. They'll fully assume it, and they'll actually find the silver lining. So whether that was it just happened intuitively is one thing, But that's also why I'm of the mindset that you can induce that resiliency by choosing to have a growth mindset. Like I'm not the only person to say, I'm not the first person to say, like Carol Dweck or these kinds of authors have proposed these paradigms prior to me endorsing this. But I really do think that sometimes it's just by chance, and sometimes there are actually things that therapy will teach you. But, you can also start that process on your own, right? To just have that mindset of, view things differently. And it gives you a sense of agency over situations or circumstances for your future or towards your future self.
Are there any other final thoughts you'd like to add?
No, I just want to really thank you, because hopefully, I was able to give. But I will tell you that before the giving piece, like just preparing for this exchange, beyond just really liking my interactions with you, I really feel like it served me. So I received in the process. So it was a reflective process for me. So I have to just thank you in my final comments.
Thank you, Tina. That's very kind of you.
You're very welcome.
I enjoyed our chat. Tina Montreuil, thank you very much.
Thank you.